the question is quite important about the Belt and Road Initiative. What is the Belt and Road Initiative? I think that there were a lot of misunderstanding and misperception of this initiative outside the China, even inside China, because there are two dimensions. I mean, it's up to what we look at this initiative. It's as a narrative or as a practice. And also, there behind this initiative, there are also domestic logic and also international logic. Many outside scholars pay attention on the international logic, but they forgot about the domestic logic. So I will, in my presentation, I will talk about pay special attention on the domestic logic. As I said, that Belt and Road Initiative are both the narrative and the practice. Let's first look at the narrative dimension. I mean, why China's government, especially President Xi, raised the initiative? I think it's his attempt to resolve the problem related to the traditional China threat phenomenon. Because there are a lot of misperception about China, especially about China's rise, and especially when Xi Jinping came to power, China became more assertive, more aggressive in the international arena, which leads to a lot of criticism from the outside world. So how to do? I think Belt and Road Initiative is one of his attempts to deal with the misperceptions about his personal, to some extent, it's his personal project. As a narrative, many scholars from outside the world are talking about the possibility of the initiative finally will turn to a new so-called tributary system of the new area. And one of the Chinese leading philosopher, Yang has published auto papers. He says that for current Chinese regime, there is a new under the heaven system. In Chinese, 天下体系, 天下 system, so under the heaven system. And I was asked many times since the 2013 when Xi Jinping firstly initiated the Belt and Road program about the tributary system and about the Tianxia system. I think both are wrong because Tianxia system, even Zhao Jingyang's, according to him, it's more like it will remind the outside world about the so-called Sinicization or Chinization of the whole system. And I don't think the BNI is a China-centric project. It's more like a new so-called new cosmopolitanism. Here are two very important factors, elements of this so-called new cosmopolitanism. Cosmos is quite understandable that there is a project with so-called with universal values. But for Chinese Communist Party and for Xi Jinping personally, I think it's not about the universal values like freedom, like democracy, like these values, but about the globalization, the free trade. Like this, I think that this is quite important for China and for the whole world. And polity is unical, it's a localization. So in China's project, actually, I mean, in the initiative, it is trying to combine two elements: universal values like free trade and other values, universal values, with the local values also. So actually, as I mentioned, it is China's response, or response of Chinese style to the China Strait phenomenon. I mean, for Chinese Communist Party, like for Xi Jinping personally, it's quite important to have a good relationship with the West. First of all, with the United States. So this is why we were witnessing the signature of these called China-United States trade disputes. Finally we have reached agreement on this. So I would like to call it as from the philosophy perspective as one of the first three words in the system. I mean, for China, we have a long history, so we have very different understanding of the world affairs. And how to deal with the West is the first or top priority of the Chinese government. We think that, as Deng Xiaoping has mentioned, that the West-East relations is the question about, or is the issue about war and peace. So for China, maybe for the outside world, especially in the United States, the perceived China as rise as a threat, and China as a competitor, not only as a competitor but a rival, and it will lead to confrontation between the two major powers. So initiative is raised as attempted to reduce the how to say the tongue of the China threat in the United States. I mean, from this perspective, there are three words. The first, the Asian word, from the ancient time until the great geographical discovery. It's the ancient, in the ancient, this is a classical word. And the second word is from the great geographical discovery to the end of the 20th century. It's a modern word. And the next 500 years, according to China's perspective, it would be a postmodern word. How the difference between these three words? The first first classical word, East is East, West is West. They have very few, contacts actually. Even we have what's called the ancient Silk Road, but actually it's the scale is not so large. And then next, the modern world. In the modern world, the West defeated the East, and with many, also negative phenomena like the colonials, like the two world wars, and so on and so on. So modernity provide a lot of benefits for the humankind, but also with many negative outputs. The third word for China, for Xi Jinping, or for his cycle, it says that in the postmodern world, the whole world are facing a lot of common challenges, including the terrorist issues, including the climate change, and so on and so on. More and more common issues, so that it is necessary for all countries in the world to jointly to deal with all of the issues. So that for the first time, the relationship between the West and the East will be not the core issues of the post-modern world. So that we can have good relations with the United States. This is why Xi Jinping, for many times, repeated that we would like to have a very good relationship with the United States. And as two major powers in contemporary world, China and the United States can not only peacefully coexist, but also can jointly do many things for the humankind. The second China threat, not only in the West, in the developed countries, but also in the developing countries, including the post-Soviet republics, even including Russia, I think, to some extent. Even Russia has never regarded itself as a developing country. It's always labeled itself as a transition country. What I mean? I mean, for the developing countries, for the countries in the Eurasian continent, which is a neighboring to our neighbors, these countries, they are afraid of China's rise, especially as an economic power. And they are afraid that they will become so-called Chinese vessels in the future. And this is a typical understanding in the post-Soviet space. I think the Chinese economy is too big, so that it will, if they have more integrated with Chinese economy, and then they will become, very dependent on China's economy. And China will be instead of Russia, will become the regional hegemon. So that for China, we think that we are a hub of the capitalist system to some extent. Even China labeled itself as a socialist country with Chinese characteristic, but still, I think, for many countries, it's more like capitalist country. Even in the West, there is a phenomenon, special term was invented as the authoritarian capitalism. So this is China's understanding is that there are also three words. This is the dimension of what's called the North-South relationship. It's about the development. And in this case, China became a hub in the capitalist system. China is a semi-peripheral country, and there are developed countries as the core and developing countries as the periphery. But China is special because China becomes the hub of the production and consumption. China imports many resources from the developing countries and then send its industrial productions to the whole world, both to the developed countries and developing countries. And in this capitalist system, the Eurasian continent, or the countries located in the Eurasian continent, have very good geographical advantages because it lies in between China and European Union. Both China and the European Union are the two of the three, cores called globalization cores. It means more than as David Carlyle, a specialist on the European integration, said that at the beginning of the 1990s, that more than 70% of the economic exchanges between three so-called globalization cores, namely the North American, West European countries, and also East Asia. Nowadays, I think China is become playing more and more important role in the East Asia. So this is why I think Kazakhstan and some other countries have changed its perception about the BRI because it received a lot of economic benefits from these issues, from participation in the BNR initiative as a transition country even. So the more economic cooperation between China and the European Union, the more benefits of the local countries will receive from this kind of economic exchange. Let's look at the practical dimension. I mean, also a lot of questions are raised. For example, as Ina has said, it's a political or it's economical. It's what's the nature of the Belt and Road Initiative? I think that the Chinese government's rhetoric is that this is not a political or geopolitical project. It's economic. But I think it's partially true, half true and half not true, because it's a more economic project rather than geopolitical. But it's with the size of the economic cooperation with the outside world, with the countries alongside the Silk Road. That means the more China will have the leverage on these countries, the more influence, geopolitical influence, China will have. So that it's not purely an economic project. It's a economic project, but with geopolitical outcome. And also, China's government said that it's not a Marshall Plan with Chinese characteristics. But I think that actually it's not true. It's also quite interesting for me because I think that they misunderstood the Marshall Plan, especially for the Xi Jinping generation. They are not well educated. They passed the cultural revolution period, and they don't know history well, And they don't know that the master plan from the very beginning actually is inclusive for all European countries, including Soviet Union, including the Eastern European countries. And also, I found many comments between the Marshall Plan and also today's China's BNI initiative, because they also it's as the anti-crisis measure only, and also it's for China also it's a inclusive project, because from the very beginning we have asked the United States to join, we have asked Japan to join. And the good example is the ARMB, I mean Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because China gave up its leading position and invited many Western European countries to join, so that the power structure inside the ARMB is quite complicated, so that coalition may be emerged between the small states in the Asia and with major powers in the European major European countries, so that actually it will give balance effect on the decision making process. So nowadays we can find that including many international financial institutions like World Bank, IMF, and also European banks of reconstruction and so on, they have not only signed some agreements with ARMB, but have very close cooperation actually with ARMB in Asia and in Eurasian region. So I think it's a very good argument to show that actually China's project from the perspective of its economic logic is really inclusive plan. So another argument is that the Japanese government has changed its attitude towards the initiative. For many years, we have, for 3 or 4 years, actually, every year I join in the Astana Club meeting. And from the very beginning, from the 2015 year, and the first 4 years, we have a very serious debate between China and the Japanese participants. Japanese raised a lot of criticism towards the BRI initiative. But last year was an exception, because Abe and visited China and also signed agreement with China. And the most important factor is that they agreed to cooperate in the third market. That means there will be new agenda for China and Russia in the so-called in the Eurasian region. So I think that the outsider also changed a little bit about their perception about this initiative. And let me turn to the third 3 words. It's quite important. It's domestic logic. I mean, many outside observers think that China's BRI initiative is international agenda. It's real. Yes, I agree. But first of all, it is a domestic project. It's a project of legitimacy for Chinese Communist Party and also for Xi Jinping. It's a project for the integration of Chinese domestic market. Why? Because China's rise in the past more than 40 years, it's not the whole China's rise. It's partially, especially it's the eastern and coast parts of China, namely the eastern and the southern part of China. So the top priority is that these regions integrated into the world market, but the middle part and the western part are not. I mean, the western part, namely including Xinjiang, including Ningxia, including Tibet and others, there are a lot of minorities, ethnic groups. And the middle part, including Henan and other provinces, they are more oriented on Beijing, on the state support. But the southern and eastern part of China is totally, I think it's fully have marketized. And So that means there's very huge gap between all of these regions. And I would like also to remind you that actually from the very beginning, from the 1978, when China's opening up policy started, the main logic of this kind of development of the Chinese region lies in the regional competition. I mean, the competition among different regions. So that means until today, we have not a very integrated Chinese domestic market. You can find many arguments that there are fragmentization of this kind of market. That means that not only every province, but every city, every counties have their own brand of different productions. For example, the Hubei, there is its own cigarettes, its own vodka, its own other beer, many productions. And it is forbidden to be sold, for example, in the Hunan province, which is neighboring to Hubei. And also many checkpoints between different cities, between different counties. We should pay for example, for the road access, to use the high-speed road, and so on. So that means there is no integrated market inside China. But if the Chinese Communist Party only to use the domestic leverage to ask all the local governors to change the situation, it's quite difficult. So China is more like, even we are called it is unique, it's not a federal, state, but in reality, I think there is official federalism and also very strong, actually, traditional influence of the regional actors. So Chinese Communist Party is not powerful enough as you imagine. It also should make consensus with the local actors. So in this context, as I mentioned, it's quite difficult for Beijing to just use the administrative measures to ask the local actors to change. But international obligations is one of the way, as it has been proved by the WTO case. So this is why Xi Jinping personally raised this initiative. It is aiming not only at the internationalization of China's production, but it is firstly is aimed at the integration of the Chinese domestic market, which means that if he can successfully build this kind of initiative, and he will receive a lot of leverage on the regional governors, and who will become really the most powerful, Chinese president. I mean, for the People's Republic of China since 1949. So this is the main logic, I think. For me, I think that the international logic is the secondary. The domestic logic is the primary goals for Xi Jinping. And if we understand this, then you can understand why he himself is so, how to say, he has tried his best to promote this initiative. Even inside China, there are a lot of critics. For example, the China-Pakistan economic corridors, actually, we know that there are a lot of risks, and from the economic perspective, actually, it's quite low effective. We have invest a lot of money, but with very few performance outcome from this economic corridor, and others are also. For example, there is many so-called China-Europe trends. Actually, also it is from an economic perspective, it's not quite effective, and there are a lot. There's actually from as I know that from inside resources, it's quite difficult for them to get benefits from this. But politically, it's quite important for him to use this leverage as a way, as an instrument to control the domestic, political elites. Maybe I will stop here. Yeah, I'm ready for any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Коллеги, ну, вполне логично, что мы сейчас попросим высказаться второго эксперта, и после этого откроем уже дискуссию, и можно будет задавать вопросы. Пожалуйста, прошу вас.
Okay. I would start by saying really that this session does fit very harmoniously with the previous one, in which Professor Coker spoke so much about China. And anyway, in any discussion of the so-called state of the world, today China is present, whether it is mentioned or if it's not mentioned. If it's not mentioned, it's like the elephant in the room. You speak about the situation of the world, but everybody thinks about China at the same time. I would then make a few comments that have to do with the history of Russian-Chinese contacts and their present situation vis-à-vis this Belt and Road program or project. Some of you might know that there was one town in Russia that for about 2 centuries symbolized Russian-Chinese trade. It's a town very little known nowadays. But it's the town from which, or through which, all the tea from China came to Siberia and to the European part of Russia, and that was Kyakhta. Kyakhta, a small town on the border between Russia and today's Mongolia, but at that time, during the 18th and the 19th centuries, Mongolia was not an independent state, but it was a protectorate of the Qing dynasty of China. And so that town was really the symbol of the success of Chinese-Russian trade contacts, to the extent that you can find in Russian literature of the first part of the 19th century expressive connections between the quality of tea and the provenance from Kyakhta. If it comes from Kyakhta, it's good tea. What happened, however, to this town? How did its prosperity end? By the opening of the Suez Canal. And thereafter, it became quicker and more efficient to transfer goods, including tea, but not limited to that, via the maritime way. And Kyakhta declined, and the Tsarist Russian regime tried to do various things to sort of sustain this town by reducing tariffs and so on, but it didn't work, and by the beginning of the 20th century, the decline of Kyakhta is complete. The merchants there tried various strategies to convince people that the best tea still comes from Kyakhta, like saying, look, if you send the tea by sea, it will get wet on the way. Better to send it via the great Siberian trade route, so-called the Sibirsky Tract. Or it was known as well as the Veliki Chayny Put, the great tea road. All that more or less ends in the beginning of the 20th century. Kyakhta declines entirely. The irony of the situation nowadays is that whenever the renewed trade with Russia and through Russia is being discussed, the argument is that if you build enough fast, high-speed roads that would cross the Russian territory, it would take just 15 days from Beijing to Moscow. Again, much quicker than the maritime road, you see. So the maritime path, which since the beginning of the Suez Canal became the quickest way, will now again become the slower way if this project is indeed realized. I say if because the implementation has been rather slow. Though the two presidents, Putin and Xi, signed an agreement on this in 2015, in practice quite little has been done. I give you an example of something that has been done. Maybe you have heard that a few months ago, I think in October or November it was, that a new bridge between China and Russia was inaugurated after being planned for many years, and people already started saying that it will never happen, but it did happen. Somebody knows at what point this bridge now connects Russia and China across the Amur River at the Blagoveshchensk, between the Blagoveshchensk and the Chinese town just on the other side, the opposite of the Chinese bank of the Amur, which the Chinese call Heilongjiang. There is the large and the growing city of Heihe, and now there is a bridge connecting those two. So this is an example of this a part of the larger project being already implemented. However, there were many other parts that never happened, or at least they haven't happened so far. And I've seen a commentary on this, that this perhaps is a result of some suspicion, some mistrust on the Russian side. For example, there was going to be a high-speed road, one of those improvements in the infrastructure that China pursues around the world in order to enable this new trade across the continents. So there should have been a high-speed road between Moscow and Kazan. And this has been shelved. So far, it is not happening. It might still be. And so that was one small irony that I wanted to point out at the very beginning, this the fact that China-Russia trade has actually a very long history. And yet, if it is to be renewed at a very large scale as part of this project, it will be again by the land route, and it will not be Kärta and it will not be tea. So it's going to be a whole new history in the trade between the two states. And then I would like to discuss a little bit the cultural or the symbolic aspect of this, which has been touched upon as well. We've been using the term One Belt, One Road initiative, which is the official term nowadays. It was originally when President Xi announced this strategy, it was really called a strategy. And then they changed the name from strategy to initiative, right? So, and the other word, the other term which is frequently repeated in this and is also the title of our panel today is the New Silk Road. And this is very widely used in China itself as well, as an alternative name for this whole project. And it is used as well in order to explain to the world, actually Ina in her beginning remarks mentioned this idea of the Silk Road as something that we in Western history, I mean, as people are living in the West, we are very familiar with this term. Again, the irony is that we are familiar with it for a very good reason, because we invented it. the Chinese didn't have such a term. Do you know when, for the first time in China, the modern term, well, the term, the Chinese equivalent of the Silk Road, not yet the new Silk Road, but the Silk Road as a reference to the historical trade which began around the 2nd century BC. When in China they started using this term for the first time, in the 1980s, right? The Chinese did have, of course, those trade routes did exist, but I say trade routes in the plural, because indeed there were several of them, and there were different names for them, right? There was no one covering umbrella term of the Silk Road. It's an invention, and the Western one. The one who invented it, in this case, we know exactly who, and we know exactly when. The German geologist and sinologist, Baron von Richthofen, in 1877, Richthofen publishes a book on China, something like 700 pages, huge, extremely influential at that time, which includes a map. And in that map, in 1877, he, for the first time, uses the term Silk Road. And note the trajectory then of this terminology. It enters a Western discourse, yes? It becomes the main Western term in reference to this historical route, yes? We're speaking again of that trade route that dates back to the 2nd century BC. And then, in the 1980s, by this circular trajectory, it reaches China, and modern China starts to use it. The point is that the idea of presenting this strategy or this initiative in the 21st century to the world as a new Silk Road, on the one hand, it uses terminology with which the West is very well familiar, yes? On the other hand, well, it is the adoption by China of the Western perspective on China. It is Westerners who called it the Silk Road, and the Chinese have adopted it and have retrospectively applied it to their own history. Kind of a reverse Orientalism, if you like. And another comparison. President Xi has another vision, very well known and closely associated with him personally, and this is the vision of the Chinese dream. Actually, both projects were announced in the same year, in 2013. The Chinese dream, does it remind you of anything? The American dream, of course, by analogy. So China too should have a dream of its own, and it was indeed presented in terms. So my argument is that what is often seen in the West as a certain process of Chinese expansion, of Chinese self-assertion vis-à-vis the West, political expansion, political threat, which came up in the previous panel, also within itself includes and rather reflects a certain need of China to earn legitimacy from the West. It reflects a certain inferiority complex that persists even now, when China is a superpower and is supposedly, you know, the future of the world. And yet these particular aspects are still there, and the use of a Western terminology to legitimize Chinese projects very much attests to it. Shall I stop here, and we'll have a discussion and maybe an exchange between us? Okay.